The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Jane Talmadge buried her husband, and the cruelty of that timing was the kind that did not soften with the passing of years. She stood at the edge of the grave in the hard yellow dirt of Cotter's Bluff, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1882, and she did not cry. She had used all of her tears in the 3 weeks prior, when Thomas had lain in the back bedroom fighting the infection that the frontier doctor said was beyond his ability to treat. She had watched the fever take him slowly, the way fire takes green wood, reluctant, smoky, leaving behind something unrecognizable. By the time they lowered him into the earth, Jane Talmadge was 31 years old, and she felt as though she had been carrying a stone inside her chest for so long that her spine had curved around the weight of it. The telegram was from her brother-in-law, a man named Clarence who lived in St. Louis, and who had never once visited them in New Mexico because he found the territory, as he put it, barbaric. The telegram informed her that under the terms of Thomas's debts she had not known the full extent of, debts Thomas had accumulated quietly over the course of their marriage in the soft, private way that some men carry their failures. The cattle operation they had built together over 8 years was effectively insolvent. The creditors would come in the spring. She had until May to either satisfy the debt or vacate the property. She folded the telegram and put it inside the pocket of her black dress, and she walked back to the house alone, and she stood in the kitchen for a very long time without moving. The ranch hands she and Thomas had employed, 2 of them, brothers named Will and Eli Marsh, had already started looking for work elsewhere. She couldn't blame them. There were cattle to tend and fences that needed repair and a water line that had been giving trouble since August, and she had no way to pay them, and they had families of their own to feed. Will came to her the morning after the funeral and held his hat in both hands and could not quite meet her eyes when he told her he was sorry, truly sorry, but that his family needed wages. She told him she understood, and she meant it, and she watched both brothers ride away before noon. The nearest town was Cotter's Bluff itself, a 10-minute ride down a rutted road. It had a general store, a livery stable, a small church, a schoolhouse, a saloon that doubled as a hotel on the 2nd floor, and a post office that shared space with the land registry office. It had something approaching 200 residents, though the number shifted with the seasons. Mining speculation had drawn people to the surrounding hills in the late 1870s, and some of them had stayed even when the silver turned out to be less generous than the speculators had hoped. Jane made the ride into town 3 days after the funeral to purchase flour and salt, and to speak with the man at the land registry about the nature of Thomas's debts. His name was Bernard Hooper, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who spoke to her with the very particular kind of pity that men in official positions extended to widows, a pity that was equal parts genuine sympathy and quiet condescension. He confirmed what the telegram had told her. The debts were real. The creditors were patient, but not infinitely so. Her best option in his professional estimation was to sell the cattle she had remaining, perhaps 40 head, and use the proceeds toward the debt, then consider returning to wherever she had come from before Thomas. She thanked him and left and stood outside on the dry wooden boardwalk in the autumn sunlight and felt the stone in her chest grow heavier. She had come from Abilene originally. Her parents were dead. She had no siblings. There was nowhere to return to. She bought her flour and her salt. She rode home. She fed the remaining cattle. She repaired, imperfectly, a section of fence that had collapsed in a windstorm the week before. She ate supper alone at the table where she and Thomas had eaten every meal for 8 years, and she looked at his empty chair, and she did not cry because the tears were still gone, replaced by something harder and heavier that sat behind her ribs and made breathing feel like an effort. It was on her 3rd trip into town, nearly 2 weeks after the funeral, that she first spoke at any real length with Perry Sutton. She had seen him before, peripherally. He had arrived in Cotter's Bluff sometime in September, just before Thomas had taken his turn for the worse, and she had noticed him the way you notice a new face in a small town. Once, then catalogued, then filed away. He was a few years younger than she was, perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was lean and sun-weathered in the way of men who spent most of their time outdoors. He had taken on odd work around town. She understood helping at the livery, repairing the church roof, fencing work for a couple of the surrounding ranches. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet, not from shyness but from some internal quality of stillness that made words feel unnecessary to him unless they had somewhere useful to go. She encountered him outside the general store. She was struggling to load 2 50-pound sacks of feed grain into the back of her small wagon, and she was managing it. She was getting it done. But it was slow and awkward work, and her hands were already raw from the fence repair and the morning's other chores. He did not ask if she needed help. He simply moved to the other end of the sack she was lifting and took hold of it, and together they got it into the wagon bed in one clean motion. She looked at him. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at the second sack. "The other one too," he said. "If you don't mind," she said. They lifted the second sack into the wagon. He stepped back and ran his thumb along the rough edge of the wagon's side panel in the absence of anything else to do with his hands. "You're Mrs. Talmadge," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "And you're Perry Sutton. I've seen you around." "I'm sorry about your husband," he said, and there was nothing theatrical about it. He said it the way you say something that is simply true and that you want the other person to know you mean. "Thank you," she said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "I heard you might need some help out at the ranch," he said, "with the cattle and the property." "I'm not looking for much in the way of wages. Room and board would do for now. Maybe a small wage once things settle. I'm good with cattle and I know fence work and I've done some water line repair." She looked at him. She was not naive and she was not reckless, and she had lived long enough on the frontier to understand that accepting a stranger's help was never without risk. But she also had 40 head of cattle and a failing water line and fences that needed proper repair and debts that were going to swallow her alive if she didn't at least try to fight them. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Because I need the work and you need the help. I don't have any other reason that's more interesting than that." She decided to believe him, not because she was desperate, though she was, but because there was something in his directness that she trusted. He wasn't performing kindness. He wasn't performing anything. "You can have the small room off the barn," she said. "It's got a cot and a stove. Meals will be simple. I'll manage $1 a week once we see whether the cattle sell." "That's fair," he said. He rode out to the ranch the following morning with his saddle roll and a single bag of belongings, and he set himself up in the room off the barn without requiring any attention from her at all. By the time she brought him his breakfast, he had already assessed the fence line and identified 3 additional sections that needed work beyond the one she had attempted, and he presented this information to her quietly over coffee and eggs with the practical tone of a man reporting facts rather than problems. This was the thing she came to understand about Perry Sutton in those early weeks. He did not create drama, and he did not require emotional management. He simply worked. He rose before she did. He was methodical and thorough, and he never left a task half-finished. He fixed the water line in the second week, a fracture near the main junction that Will Marsh had been patching temporarily for months, and then he rebuilt the section of fence properly and moved on to the next problem without asking for acknowledgement. She did not talk to him much at first. She was not sure she had the capacity for conversation, truly, not the kind that extended beyond the logistical. She was getting through each day by moving forward through it, one foot and then the other, the way you walk a muddy road, not gracefully, not quickly, but without stopping. He seemed to understand this without being told. He did not hover. He did not ask her how she was feeling. He did not look at her with that particular sympathetic expression that people had been wearing at her for the past 3 weeks, the one that meant they wanted her to perform her grief so that they could feel useful by witnessing it. He treated her like a person who was managing a difficult situation, not like a woman in need of rescue. And the difference between those two things was, she found, enormous. Twice in the first week she woke in the middle of the night and could not return to sleep. The second time she walked out to the porch in the cold and sat on the step with a blanket around her shoulders, and after a few minutes Perry came out of the barn room and stood a few feet away, looking at the same darkness she was looking at. "Can't sleep," she said. It was not a question. "Never been much of a sleeper," he said. They sat out there for perhaps 40 minutes. He did not ask her what she was thinking about, and she did not volunteer it. And when the cold became too much, she went inside and he went back to the barn, and that was that. But something had shifted, very slightly, the way the earth shifts in the night when no one is watching, not dramatically, not perceptibly in the moment, but measurably when you look back at where things were. October became November. The nights grew sharp and the mornings had frost in them. She began to talk to him at mealtimes, initially just about practical matters, the state of the pasture, the best timing for moving the cattle to better grazing, the question of what to do about the roof on the smaller outbuilding, and then gradually about other things. Small things, observations about the weather, a comment about the newspaper she had gotten from town, a memory that surfaced unexpectedly while she was doing the dishes. One evening she told him about how she had come to Cotter's Bluff. She and Thomas had come out from Abilene in the spring of 1874 with $120 and a wagon and the intention of building something permanent. They had been 23 and 24 respectively, full of that particular confidence that the young have when the future seems more real than any present obstacle. The ranch had taken 5 years to become genuinely productive, and there had been lean years that had scared her more than she had let Thomas see, and there had been a child, a son, who had been born in 1877 and had lived for 7 weeks before a fever took him. And she did not usually talk about the boy, but she found herself mentioning him now, just briefly, just the fact of him, and Perry listened without attempting to soften it or redirect it. "His name was Samuel," she said. "Good name," Perry said. That was all. She had not wanted consolation. She had wanted to say his name out loud to another living person, and Perry seemed to understand that distinction. She began to see, slowly, that the stone in her chest was not lighter. It was exactly as heavy as it had always been, but that it had somehow become less isolating. Not because Perry was doing anything to remove it. Not because he was talking her through her grief or guiding her towards some imagined future brightness. Simply because he was there, walking around with his own quietness and his own history that he did not fully reveal, going about the work of each day alongside her, so that the weight of the stone was still entirely hers, but she was not carrying it in an empty room. She didn't examine this feeling too closely at first. She was not in the market for a feeling. She had a ranch to save. November brought a real problem. One of the larger cattle buyers who operated out of Santa Fe had sent a representative to assess the region's stock, and Jane learned through Bernard Hooper, who had, despite everything, turned out to be willing to pass along useful information, that there was a reasonable market for beef cattle going into the winter, better than it would be in the spring. If she could get her 40 head to the buyer's agent by the end of November, she could likely recover enough to satisfy at least a portion of the debt and negotiate an extension on the remainder. The problem was that the most direct route to the collection point, a small station town called Myra's Crossing about 35 miles southeast, passed through a stretch of land that had been the subject of a grazing dispute between a local ranching outfit called the Devoy Operation and several smaller landholders. The Devoys were not outlaws in the formal sense. They had never been indicted for anything that had stuck, but they were the kind of men who expressed their property disagreements in physical terms, and Jane had heard enough to know that a lone woman driving 40 cattle through disputed range with only one hired hand was an invitation to trouble. Perry listened to all of this over breakfast one morning without interruption. "You want to avoid the Devoy Range," he said when she finished. "I want to avoid any situation that slows us down or costs us cattle," she said. "We go the northern way. It adds nearly 2 days to the drive." "The northern way adds time but not risk," he said. "The Devoy way saves time but costs us certainty. What's the deadline on the buyer's agent?" "He's at Myra's Crossing until the 30th of November." He looked at the calendar on the wall. It was the 14th. "Northern way gives us time," he said. "We leave the 18th. We can do it." She looked at him. "You've driven cattle before." "Yes," he said. She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. "All right," she said. "Northern way." They spent the next 4 days preparing. Perry checked every animal, identified the two that were too thin to make good weight at market and suggested they keep them back, assessed the equipment, repaired the wagon's left rear wheel, and organized the supply pack with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work for a long time. Jane sorted through the ranch's accounts again, made a precise accounting of what the cattle should bring, wrote a letter to the debt holder, a banking firm in Albuquerque, explaining her intentions and requesting confirmation of the extension terms. The morning they set out was cold and clear, the kind of New Mexico November day that started with ice on the water buckets and became warm enough by midday to make you wish you hadn't worn so many layers. Jane rode her horse at the flank of the herd and Perry rode point, keeping the cattle moving in a loose, manageable way that spoke of genuine experience. The northern route took them up through a series of gentle hills and then down into a long valley that was mostly empty in those days. A few homesteads widely spaced, a good creek, decent grazing for rest stops. The first night they camped beside the creek. Perry built a fire that was small and efficient, and she cooked beans and salt pork and cornbread in a cast iron pan, and they ate in the firelight with the cattle grazing peacefully at the edge of the darkness. "Tell me something," she said. "Not demanding, not needy. Just curious, the way you become curious about someone when you've worked beside them long enough that the silence has been thoroughly established and you finally want to hear the voice inside it." He looked up from his plate. "Where are you from?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Texas originally, East Texas, a town called Jasper." "You came a long way," she said. "Gradually," he said. She waited. "I had a farm there," he said. "With my father. After he passed, there wasn't much reason to stay." A pause. "That was 5 years ago. And you've been moving since?" "Working," he said. "Cattle drives mostly, some farm work. A season building railroad grade down near El Paso. I'm not—" He stopped. He seemed to be deciding how much to say. "I'm not the kind of person who stays in one place easily. I haven't been. I don't say that with any particular pride." She studied him in the firelight. There was something he wasn't saying, and she recognized the shape of it because she had her own unsaid things and she did not press. "My husband was from Texas," she said. "San Antonio." "I know. He came into town a couple of times before he got sick. We talked at the bar once just briefly. He seemed like a good man." She looked at the fire. "He was," she said. "He had his failings, the debts he should have told me, but he was a good man." "The best ones usually have something they couldn't quite say," Perry said. She looked at him then, and there was something in his eyes that told her he was speaking from more than theoretical knowledge, and she filed this away without comment. The second day of the drive was longer and more difficult. One of the cattle, a large brindle steer, decided in the early afternoon that it had its own preferred direction and launched itself at the edge of the herd's movement with the stubborn stupidity of which cattle are uniquely capable. Perry cut around it on horseback with practiced ease and got it turned back into the group without drama. But then a section of the herd bunched up at a narrow creek crossing, and it took both of them working in tandem for 20 minutes to get all 40 moving across without losing any. She worked alongside him without hesitation, reading the cattle the way you learn to read them after years, knowing which ones would follow pressure and which ones needed to be led. And she found that working beside him in a moment that required genuine skill and coordination produced a particular kind of trust, the kind that doesn't come from conversation, but from the shared experience of doing something difficult together and doing it well. By the time they crossed and got the herd moving south again, she was warm from the exertion, and there was the ghost of something on her face that had not been there in many weeks. It was not quite a smile, but it was the direction of one. He saw it and said nothing, and she was glad of that. They reached Myra's crossing on the afternoon of the 21st, 2 days ahead of the buyer's deadline. The buyer's agent was a sharp-eyed man named Cornelius Webb, who wore a suit that was too nice for the territory and who walked through the cattle with the calculating attention of someone who made his living on margin. He pushed on the price, as Jane had expected he would. She pushed back, citing the quality of the beef and the state of the market, and Perry stood slightly behind her and slightly to the side and said nothing at all. But his presence was that of a man who was not going to be moved by much, and Webb seemed to read this correctly. She got $14 a head for 38 cattle, which was better than fair by current standards, and she came away with $532, which was enough to cover the principal amount of one of the 2 outstanding debts in full and put a significant dent in the second. She sat with the money in the small hotel room she had taken for the night in Myra's crossing, and she counted it twice, and she let herself feel, for the first time in 2 months, something that was in the neighborhood of relief. Not happiness, not resolution, but the sense that the ground beneath her was slightly more solid than it had been the day before. She went downstairs to the small dining room where Perry was having coffee, and she sat across from him and told him the number, and he nodded in the way he had of receiving good information, calmly, without theatrics, as though good outcomes were to be expected when you worked properly toward them. "That covers the Albuquerque bank," he said. "In full," she said, "and a portion of the second debt. I'll need to negotiate the rest." "You'll negotiate it," he said, without any particular emphasis, as though this were simply an accurate statement about the world. She looked at him across the table. The dining room was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and there were 2 other men at a far table playing cards, and outside the window the main street of Myra's crossing was quiet in the blue dusk, and she thought, "I have not felt warm in a very long time, and I feel warm right now, and I do not entirely understand why." She did not say any of this. She ordered supper. They ate. They talked about the drive home, which they would begin in the morning on horseback, leaving the wagon at Myra's crossing to be retrieved later. It was practical conversation, and it was easy, and by the time she went upstairs to her room she was aware that something had been quietly building in her, like water rising behind a dam, and she was not ready to name it, and she was not sure she wanted to. The ride back to Cotter's Bluff took 2 days. They were easier days than the ones on the drive, just 2 people on horseback on the open land, moving at a comfortable pace, and the late November sky was enormous and pale, and the hills had gone brown and gold, and there was a quiet beauty to the landscape that she had been too submerged in her grief to notice for a long time. She began to notice it now. On the first afternoon of the ride back, they stopped at the top of a long ridge and looked out over the valley below, and she said, without really planning to, "I forgot it was beautiful here." Perry looked at the valley. "When did you forget?" "When Thomas got sick, I think. Before that, even. When you're trying too hard to hold something together, you stop seeing it." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that feeling," he said. She looked at him. "What were you trying to hold together?" A long pause. The wind moved through the grass on the ridge. "After my father died," he said slowly, "I stayed on the farm for almost a year trying to make it work, trying to keep it the way he had built it. I wasn't seeing anything by the end. Not the land, not the people around me. I was just carrying the weight of it and forgetting to look up." "What made you finally leave?" He turned and looked at her. There was something very direct and very honest in his expression. "The day I realized I was staying for him rather than for me, that I was honoring his memory by slowly destroying myself." A pause. "That's not wisdom, that's just what happened. I'm not sure I figured it out so much as I got worn down to the truth of it." She held his gaze for a moment, Then she looked back at the valley. "I'm not sure I'm ready to look up yet," she said, "but I notice I'm doing it." "That's enough," he said. "That's how it starts." December arrived, and with it a hard cold that came down from the north and settled over the ranch like something with intention. Jane rode into town to negotiate the second debt with the land registry and found, through a circuitous conversation with Bernard Hooper, that the second creditor, a private lending outfit based in Denver, had assigned the debt to a local representative who had the authority to settle. She spent 2 afternoons in town working through the terms and emerged with an agreement to pay the remaining amount over the course of 18 months at a rate she could manage if the ranch produced, and if she was careful. It was not a perfect outcome, but it was a workable one. She told Perry over supper that evening, and he listened and then said, "You know what you're doing." "I'm figuring it out as I go," she said. "That's what knowing what you're doing looks like," he said. "Most people who claim certainty are just pretending." She laughed. It surprised her, both the laugh and how it felt, rusty and real, like a door opening on hinges that hadn't moved in months. Perry looked at her when she laughed, and his expression shifted in a way that was barely perceptible, but that she caught anyway, something that moved across his face quickly, like light through water, and then was still again. She noticed it and tucked it away. The weeks between December and the new year moved differently than the weeks before had. The grief was still there. She did not think it was the kind of thing that simply left, not the grief for Thomas and not the grief for Samuel, not even the grief for the younger version of herself who had ridden into this territory with $120 and absolute conviction. But it had settled somehow, the way sediment settles in a jar of water when you stop shaking it. It was still in there. It was not gone, but she could see through it now, at least a little. She and Perry fell into a routine that had warmth in it. Coffee in the morning before work, him coming in from the barn still carrying the cold of the outdoors on his coat. She would have the pot ready and the eggs going by the time he came in, and he would sit at the table and they would talk about the day's work with a naturalness that felt, she thought, remarkably like companionship. She did not examine it too hard. She simply let it be. In the evenings, when the work was done and the supper was finished and the cold had closed down over the land outside, they sometimes sat by the kitchen stove, and she would mend something or write in the account ledger and he would read. He had a small collection of books in his bag, which surprised her, because there was something about Perry Sutton that most people would not have immediately associated with reading, but he read seriously and with evident pleasure. Once she asked him what he was reading and he showed her the spine, a volume of Shakespeare's histories. "You read Shakespeare," she said. "My father did," he said. "He was a school teacher before he took up farming. He read to me every evening until I was old enough to do it myself. He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was," Perry said simply. She went back to her mending, but something in her chest was different, not lighter exactly, but warmer. The stone was still there, but it had, she thought, perhaps been moved slightly from the coldest part of her chest toward the center, where there was at least some warmth nearby. Christmas came quietly. She had not planned to mark it especially, but on Christmas morning she came downstairs to find that Perry had cut a small juniper branch from the tree near the barn and stood it in an empty tin on the kitchen table, and that he had made, she did not know when, in whatever dark morning hours preceded her waking, a pan of gingerbread, which was imperfect and slightly lopsided but which smelled extraordinary, and which told her several things about him that she had not known. Among them that he could bake, and that he had thought about her enough in advance of this day to do something kind for it. She stood in the kitchen looking at the juniper branch and the gingerbread and felt something move through her chest that was both sweet and painful, the way the best things feel when you have been a long time without them. He came in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her face. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to presume. I wasn't trying to." "Don't apologize," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Don't you dare apologize." He stood in the doorway in the cold air with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with that direct, honest expression that she had come to rely on, and she blinked and squared her shoulders and said, It's the most thoughtful thing anyone has done for me in a very long time. Thank you." He nodded once and came inside, and she cut the gingerbread and they ate it with their coffee, and it was, despite everything or perhaps because of it, a good morning. She thought about it for several days after. She thought about the fact that she had been watching him for 2 months, quietly, cataloging the small things, the way he fixed things gently rather than forcefully, the way he listened without filling silences with unnecessary sound, the way he never treated her as someone in need of managing, the way he had stood beside her through the cattle drive and the debt negotiations and the long, cold November nights on the ranch, and had asked absolutely nothing of her emotionally except her presence. He had simply been there, steady and unhurried, walking beside the weight of everything she was carrying, and she had felt, because of it, less alone. And she realized with the particular alarm of someone who was not looking for such a realization, falling in love with him. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before doing anything about it. She examined it from several angles. She thought about Thomas, about whether it was too soon, about whether she was merely redirecting grief, about whether the warmth she felt toward Perry was real feeling or desperation or some other thing that she would regret. She concluded, after honest examination, that it was none of those things. Perry Sutton was real. What she felt for him was different from what she had felt for Thomas, not lesser but simply different, older and quieter, and perhaps more considered, the way things are when you come to them in your 30s rather than your early 20s. She had loved Thomas with the wide-open certainty of youth. What she felt building for Perry was something she had more respect for somehow, because she knew now what love had to survive, and she was choosing it anyway. The question was what he felt. She had caught him looking at her in certain ways at certain moments. She had caught him making the small extra gesture, the gingerbread, the way he saved the warmest cup of coffee for her side of the stove, the way he had once briefly put his hand over hers on the fence rail when she had been struggling to keep the wire taut while he nailed, just for a steadying moment, just long enough to be useful, and then removed it. These were not the gestures of a man who was indifferent. But Perry Sutton was a person of great restraint, and she did not know what he kept behind that restraint. She decided she needed to find out. She found her moment in the first week of January, 1883, on an afternoon when the work was done early because a coming storm had moved them through the remaining tasks in focused haste. They were sitting by the kitchen stove, the sky outside having gone the particular pewter color that meant serious snow was on the way, and the house was warm and quiet, and she set down the mending she had been pretending to attend to and looked at him. "Perry," she said. He looked up from his book. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly," she said, "because I think we're both the kind of people who can do that." He set the book down. "All right. Are you staying?" She asked. "I mean when the spring comes and the situation here is more stable and you could take work anywhere. Are you staying?" He was quiet for a moment. His eyes were on her face with the full attention he gave things that mattered to him. "Do you want me to?" he asked, not evasively, genuinely. He was asking because the answer would determine everything. She held his gaze. "I want you to stay because you want to stay," she said carefully, "not because you feel some obligation. Not because the work requires it. I want to know what Perry Sutton wants." Another long moment. The wind had begun to push against the windows. "I want to stay," he said quietly. "I have wanted to stay since." He stopped and started again. "Since about October, if I'm honest. But I wasn't going to say anything because it wasn't my place, and you were in the middle of something very hard, and I'm not the kind of man who would put his own feelings in front of your grief. I didn't think that was right." The warmth in her chest was almost unbearable in the best possible way. "You have never put yourself in front of anything," she said. "That is the thing about you, Perry. You just walked alongside it. You never asked me to put it down or pretend it wasn't there. You just walked beside me while I carried it." He was looking at her with an expression that was stripped of its usual reserve, and what was underneath was something that she recognized. "You have no idea," he said, with a roughness in his voice she had not heard before, what it has cost me to just walk alongside it." "Tell me," she said. He was out of his chair before she could draw another breath, not rushed, not dramatic, but certain, the way he moved when he had made a decision. He came and crouched in front of her chair and took both of her hands in both of his, and he looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and the snow had begun to fall outside. She could hear it hissing against the windows, and the stove burned warm and orange in the corner. "Jane," he said, "I am 30 years old, and I have spent 5 years going from one place to the next trying to find something that I could stay for, and I did not expect to find it here, and I did not expect it to be you, and I am not sorry at all that it is." She brought one hand free and put it against the side of his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment like someone who had been waiting for something they weren't sure they deserved. "I'm not finished grieving," she said honestly. "I need you to know that. I'm not finished carrying what I'm carrying. Thomas was 8 years of my life, and Samuel was, her voice held. I carry them. I will carry them." "I know," he said. His eyes were open again, and they were very close and very clear. "I am not asking you to put anything down. I swear to God I am not asking that." "I know you're not," she said. "That's why I'm telling you yes." He kissed her then, gently, carefully, the way you hold something you think might be breakable, and then with more warmth as she kissed him back with all the honest feeling of a woman who had been carrying a stone in her chest for a very long time and had finally, without losing the stone, found someone standing beside the weight of it. The snow fell all night. In the morning, the world was white and still and entirely quiet, and Jane Talmadge made breakfast for 2 people and found that the kitchen did not feel as large as it had been feeling, and the stone in her chest had not gone anywhere, but the warmth next to it had expanded considerably. January and February of 1883 were cold and slow and full of the particular intimacy that hard winters produce when the work is limited, and the house is small, and 2 people are honest with each other. They talked more in those months than they had in all the months before, talked about everything. Eventually, the way you talk when you have stopped performing and started actually being with someone. He told her about his father, fully this time, not just the fact of him but the real man, a schoolteacher named Perry Sutton who had read Shakespeare and also Dickens, and also the letters of George Washington, who had farmed in East Texas, not with great success but with great love, who had died of a heart failure while plowing a field in April of 1878, a death that was so ordinary and so completely sudden that Perry had found him still holding the plow handles. She told him about Samuel, the full story, the 7 weeks, how the boy had had dark hair like Thomas and blue eyes that were hers, how he had been a noisy and vigorous infant right up until the morning he was not, how she had come into the bedroom in the early morning light and found him changed overnight by the fever, and how she had sat with him for the remaining hours of his short life and talked to him and sung to him, and how she had never stopped wondering whether she had done something wrong, whether there was something she had missed, whether she had been in some way insufficient. Perry listened to all of this without flinching and without offering her the facile assurances that people had been offering her for 6 years, that it was God's will, that she couldn't have known, that these things happen. He simply held her hand and listened, and when she was finished he said, "There was nothing wrong with you. There was nothing you missed. I need you to hear me say that, even if you can't yet believe it." She had cried then, properly cried, for the first time since before the funeral, and it was not the terrible dry absence of tears she had been living in but actual grief moving through her, warm and awful and real, and Perry sat beside her and kept hold of her hand and did not try to stop it or speed it up or make it mean something tidy, and when it finally passed she felt scraped clean and exhausted and somehow lighter, or at least differently burdened. "Thank you," she said when she could speak. "For what?" he said. "For not trying to fix it. It's not broken," he said. "It's just part of you. Samuel is part of you. There's nothing to fix." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that for a long time in the February cold, the stove burning, the wind outside doing whatever the wind did, And inside the room there was something that had taken months to build and that was, now, unmistakably and entirely real. Spring came in the way it does in New Mexico. Suddenly, and with enormous conviction, the hills going green overnight it seemed, the mornings warming up into something that felt like promise rather than threat. Jane rode into town on a bright April morning and paid the first of the scheduled payments on the second debt, and Bernard Hooper received it and recorded it and looked at her across his ink-stained desk with an expression that was almost admiring and told her she was doing very well, Mrs. Talmadge, very well indeed. She smiled at him and thought, I know. She and Perry had a conversation about the ranch's future in late March, a practical conversation that was also, beneath its practicality, a conversation about their own future, which had by then become so completely intertwined with the ranch's that the two could not be separated. If we bring in a small number of cattle to replace the ones we sold, Perry said, spreading the account ledger on the table and running his finger down the columns, and if we lease the back pasture to the Milner family for summer grazing, they've been asking and the rate is decent, we can cover the debt payment and start building a small operating reserve at the same time. You've been thinking about this for a while, she said. I've been thinking about it since I got here, he admitted. I didn't think it was my place to say much before. She looked at him. It is your place, she said. It is as much your place as mine if you want it to be. He was very still for a moment. Then I want it to be. She covered his hand with hers on the ledger. Then let's make the plan together, she said. He did not ask her to marry him that day. He asked her in May, which she had always thought of as the right month for things that were meant to grow, on an evening when the air was warm and the stars were enormous, and they had ridden out to check the Milner family's cattle on the leased pasture, and then sat on a hillside with their horses grazing nearby, and the whole of the territory spread out below them in the fading light. He did not make an elaborate production of it. He turned to look at her and said, Jane Talmadge, I would very much like to spend the rest of my life walking beside you. Whatever you're carrying, I want to walk beside it. Will you marry me? She looked at him for a long moment, the man who had arrived in her life in the worst months of it and who had not tried to fix her or save her or redirect her grief into something more convenient, who had simply been present in the most honest and steady way she had ever experienced, who had walked beside the weight of everything she carried without ever once asking her to set it down. Yes, she said. With my whole heart, yes. He smiled then, a full smile, unguarded, the one she had been learning to produce in him for months, and he kissed her under the enormous New Mexico sky, and the horses grazed nearby in the warm May evening, and it was one of the best moments of her life. They were married in June, in the small church in Cotter's Bluff, by a minister named Reverend Aldies, who was genuinely pleased to be performing a wedding rather than a funeral and who said so. The ceremony was attended by a modest collection of the town's residents and 2 neighboring ranch families and Bernard Hooper, who wore his best ink-stained suit and cried, which surprised everyone including him. The Milner family brought flowers from their garden and Jane wore a dress that she and the wife of the general store owner, a woman named Clara Finch, had spent 3 weeks altering from a bolt of blue cotton, and Perry wore his good shirt and the vest he had purchased from the dry goods store 2 days before, and had his hair cut properly for the first time in the year she had known him. And he looked at her when she came down the aisle between the pews, with an expression on his face that she thought she would carry for the rest of her life. After, there was a small gathering at the ranch, with food that the neighboring women had contributed and music from a fiddle player named Old Marcus, who was in his 70s and still played beautifully, and who did so for 3 hours straight without apparent fatigue. There was dancing in the yard, the kind of informal, spinning, laughing dancing that happens when people are genuinely happy and not performing happiness. And Jane danced with Perry and also with Bernard Hooper, who turned out to be a surprisingly good dancer for an ink-stained bureaucrat. And there was food and warmth and the sound of voices and the fireflies coming out in the dusk, and it was, from beginning to end, a thoroughly good day. When everyone had gone and the yard was quiet and the fireflies had settled into the grass, Jane and Perry sat on the porch together in the dark with 2 cups of coffee, and she leaned her back against his chest and his arms came around her, and the stone was still there. It was always there. She understood now that it would always be there. But it was warm, surrounded by warmth, and it was not the unbearable weight it had been a year ago. It was simply part of her, and Perry held all of her, the stone included, and she let herself be held. "Thank you," she said into the dark. "For what?" His voice was warm against her hair. "For not asking me to be different than I am." His arms tightened slightly. "Why would I ask that?" he said. "The woman you are is the only one I want." The summer of 1883 was good. The Milner lease income combined with the ranch's operations to produce the most financially stable period the property had seen in years. Perry turned out to have a genuine talent for the business side of things, which surprised her slightly. She had known he could work, but he could also think strategically about the work, planning 2 seasons ahead, watching markets, making decisions with a measured confidence that made her confident in turn. They operated as partners in the true sense, each bringing different strengths, arguing sometimes with the productive friction of 2 people who respected each other enough to disagree, but never once losing the basic thread of mutual trust. She hired on a hand named Gabriel Torres in August, a young man, 20 years old, the son of a family that had been in New Mexico territory for generations, who knew cattle and knew the land and who worked with the focused intensity of someone who had something to prove. Perry and Gabriel took to each other quickly, working together in a way that was comfortable and easy, and Jane was glad of it. The second debt payment was made in October, on schedule, and Jane made it in person at the land registry, and then stood on the boardwalk outside and let the clean October air move over her face and felt something that was very close to free. She realized, happy. Not in the simple, uncomplicated way of someone who has never known sorrow, but in the deeper, more earned way of someone who has carried real weight and found, without setting it down, a life worth living alongside it. In the early winter of that year she began to suspect, and by December she was certain, and on a cold evening in mid-December she told Perry over supper without preamble, because she had never been a woman for preamble, "I believe I am with child." He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was so purely unguarded that it nearly undid her hope and joy and something that was almost fear, the fear of someone who wants something very much and knows the wanting makes him vulnerable. "Are you well?" he said. The first thing he said was not congratulation or exclamation, but that, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "I am very well." He came around the table to her and she stood and they held each other for a long moment, and she could feel his heart beating under his ribs, steady and fast at the same time, and she put her palm flat against his chest and he put his hand over hers. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "I am here. I'm not going anywhere." She knew this. She had known it since October of the previous year, had been learning it deeper and deeper with every month. She knew it in her bones. The pregnancy was not easy. The winter was hard, and she was sick in the early months in a way that she had not been with Samuel, a persistent nausea that lasted past the first weeks and into the middle months. And there were mornings when she could not rise from the bed, until well past the time she was accustomed to rising. Perry took on more of the ranch work without commentary, and brought her dry biscuits and weak tea in the mornings, and did not make her feel guilty for her body's requirement that she rest. She had moments of terror. She could not help it, knowing what she knew about Samuel, knowing how fast things could change. The fear was not irrational, it was entirely rational, and she would sometimes lie awake in the dark with the fear sitting on her chest alongside the stone. Perry held her on those nights. He did not tell her not to be afraid. He held her, and sometimes he talked quietly about nothing in particular, the work the next day, a book he was reading, a memory of his father, until she felt the fear quiet down to a manageable level, and then he was quiet with her until she slept. She went to see the doctor in Cotter's Bluff regularly, a newer man named Dr. Beaumont, who had arrived in town in 1882 with a proper medical degree from back east and who was, by the standards of the frontier, unusually thorough. He monitored her progress with careful attention and told her, in April, that things appeared to be proceeding well and that the baby seemed strong. She allowed herself, on the strength of that report, to begin preparing. She and Clara Finch, who had become a genuine friend through the previous year's altering of the dress project, spent several afternoons in the spring working on a small cradle that Perry had built and on collecting and stitching the small necessary garments. Clara had 3 children of her own and was practical and kind, and not given to alarming stories, which Jane appreciated enormously. Perry finished the cradle in March. He had built it himself from a piece of good pine, smoothed and fitted with quiet craftsmanship, and put it in the corner of the bedroom and stood looking at it for a moment with an expression that was entirely private. And Jane watched him from the doorway and felt the stone in her chest and the warmth in her chest simultaneously, as she often did now, the grief and the hope existing together in the same space, neither canceling the other. The baby arrived on a warm evening in late June, 1884. His name was Henry Thomas Sutton, which was both of their fathers in one name, and he arrived into the world with an opinion about it that he expressed loudly and at length, which made Dr. Beaumont and Clara Finch and Perry, who was downstairs in the kitchen being heroically patient, and going slowly out of his mind with anxiety, all exhale with enormous relief. When Perry came upstairs and Jane placed the boy in his arms, Perry stood in the middle of the bedroom holding his son with the careful, astonished focus of someone who has been handed something that exceeds their ability to fully comprehend, and then he looked at Jane and his face was doing several things at once, none of them entirely controllable, and she thought, there it is. There is the man behind the reserve. Henry Thomas, Perry said, very softly, looking at the baby. Your father and mine, she said. Both of them remembered. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and she leaned against him, and the baby made a small, dissatisfied sound, and then settled. And outside the window the June evening was golden and full of the sound of the ranch's evening birds, and the stone was in her chest where it always was, and the warmth was everywhere, and this was, she thought, the moment she would tell him she had been living toward, without knowing it, for the worst year and the best year of her life combined. Henry was a vigorous and thoroughly opinionated boy who grew in the way healthy children grow steadily, and with momentum, demanding food and attention and the full engagement of everyone in his vicinity. He loved the cattle with an early enthusiasm that made both of his parents laugh, pointing at them from a very young age with an expression of pure satisfaction and making sounds that he clearly intended to mean something specific. He was dark-haired like both his parents and had Jane's blue eyes and Perry's ability to be completely still when he was concentrating. The ranch flourished. Gabriel tours had become indispensable, and they had brought on a second hand by 1885. A steady older man named Vicent who had 30 years of cattle knowledge and who taught Perry things about the local land and the local water that proved invaluable. The second debt was paid in full 6 months ahead of the extended schedule, and Jane went to Bernard Hooper's office to make the final payment, and he shook her hand with both of his and said, Mrs. Sutton, it has been a genuine pleasure watching you do this. She had thought, when she came to this territory 8 years ago as Jane Talmadge with Thomas Talmadge and $120, that she was building something. She had been right. She just had not known quite what the shape of it would turn out to be. The years that followed were the good years, not perfect, not without difficulty, because nothing is, but good in the deep solid sense of years that are lived fully and honestly, and with the kind of love that has been earned rather than stumbled into. There was a drought in 1886 that was hard on everyone, and that required careful management and some painful decisions about herd size. And there was a winter of 1887 that was the coldest Jane had experienced in New Mexico, and that tested all of them. And there were ordinary small griefs. Gabriel Torres left in the fall of 1886 to marry and start his own operation, and they missed him. And old Marcus, the fiddle player, died in the spring of 1887. And the town felt his absence in its music and its celebrations. But through all of it, Perry was there, steady and present, walking beside whatever the years brought, walking beside her with the same quality of companionship that had first told her, in the winter after the worst year of her life, that this was someone worth walking beside in return. He talked more as the years went on. Not dramatically so, he was always a person of measured speech. But the reserve had eased, the way ice eases in the spring, gradually and then completely. And there was a warmth to him that had always been there, and that was simply more visible now, worn on the outside where she and Henry and the people of Cotter's Bluff could see it. He became known in town as a reliable man, which was the highest compliment the territory offered. He served 2 terms on the town's informal board of landholders, which was the closest thing Cotter's Bluff had to local governance. He helped the Milner family when their barn burned in the spring of 1885, organizing the rebuilding effort with the practical competence of someone who simply looked at a problem and solved it. He was, Jane thought, one of those rare men who created a kind of order around them, not by demanding it, but by embodying it. In the summer of 1887, Henry turned 3 and learned to ride a small horse named Pepper with the focused intensity of his father and the cheerful confidence of his mother. And Perry walked beside horse and boy in the afternoon sunlight, and Jane watched from the fence rail and thought about the night she had carried feed grain out of the general store in Cotter's Bluff on a cold autumn morning in 1882. And a quiet man with dark hair had simply taken hold of the other end without asking. And how a life had grown from that moment, quietly and thoroughly and with great beauty. She was thinking about this when Henry fell off Pepper with a small, indignant crash and bounced in the dirt, and immediately got back up and looked at the horse with an expression of pure negotiation, clearly deciding whose fault it was. And Perry was beside him instantly, crouching down to check for damage and finding none. And Henry said something and Perry laughed, that full, unguarded laugh that she had learned to produce in him, and that was one of her favorite sounds in the world. She called to them from the fence, and Perry looked over at her, and there was something in his face that was as simple and as complete as anything she had ever seen. A man looking at his wife from across a yard, where his son was learning to ride a horse in the late afternoon light, looking at her with a love so practiced and so permanent that it required no performance. She felt it all at once. The stone still in her chest, Thomas and Samuel carried there always, the grief that did not end but that had found its place, and next to it and around it and filling the spaces between, the warmth of this life and this man and this brown-eyed boy getting back on his horse in the afternoon sun. She had not put the stone down. She never would. But she had learned to carry it in a life worth carrying it in. In the spring of 1888, Jane discovered she was pregnant again. She told Perry in the kitchen on a morning in March with the straightforwardness that had always characterized her communication with him, and he took this information with the same mix of hope and careful anxiety he had shown the first time, and she laughed at the expression on his face and told him they had managed it once before and they would manage it again. This pregnancy was easier than the first had been. The sickness was milder and shorter, and Jane was more settled in her body and her knowledge of it. Henry, who was 4 years old and very much his parents' son in his powers of observation, announced to the family on an afternoon in April that there was definitely something different about Mama, and he wanted to know what it was, which made Perry cover his mouth with his hand to conceal what was happening to his face. They told Henry in simple terms that there was a baby coming, and Henry received this information with the gravity of a person who was not sure how he felt about sharing his position in the universe and needed time to consider it. By the following week he had decided he was in favor of a sibling, provided it was the right kind, and had developed a strong and specific preference for a brother, which he expressed clearly and frequently. The baby arrived in September of 1888, a girl healthy and emphatic, and possessed from her first hours of an aliveness that filled the room. Henry, informed of his sister, adjusted with greater speed than might have been predicted. Within 2 days he had appointed himself her protector, and was spending conspicuous time near the cradle with an expression of proprietary responsibility, which Perry found enormously amusing and Jane found deeply moving, because she could see Perry in that expression, the steadiness of it, the willingness to stand beside something precious without being asked to. They named her Eleanor Rose Sutton, and she was from the beginning a child of great beauty and great will, with dark curling hair and eyes that shifted between green and gray depending on the light and the weather, and who had an opinion about the entire world and was not shy about expressing it. By 1889, the Sutton Ranch, they had changed the name quietly, at some point that couldn't be precisely identified, from the Talmadge property to the Sutton Ranch, and it had felt right without ceremony, was one of the more stable operations in the surrounding region. They had weathered drought and hard winter and debt and isolation, and built something that had real permanence to it, the kind of permanence you earn rather than inherit. Jane turned 38 in the spring of 1889. She and Perry were sitting on the porch after supper, the children in bed, the night warm and full of stars, and she was thinking about the question of permanence and what it meant, and Perry was beside her in the old way, not talking, not requiring anything, simply present. She had a thought she had been carrying for some time, and she decided to give it voice. "I want to buy the north parcel," she said. "The one that's been unclaimed since the Dawson family left. It would extend the water access and give us room to expand the herd properly." Perry turned his head to look at her. "I've been thinking about the same thing," he said. "I ran the numbers last week. We could do it." She looked at him. Of course he had. Of course he had been running the same numbers she had in parallel in the quiet inner workings of his mind. "How is it," she said with great affection, "that we always arrive at the same place?" He looked at her in the dark with a warmth that had never diminished in 7 years and that she did not think would diminish in 70. "We started from the same place," he said. "We were always going to end up here." She took his hand and held it, and they sat in the warm Texas night. No, New Mexico night, always New Mexico, this land that had claimed her and that she had claimed in return. And the stars were very large and the ranch was quiet. And inside the house, Henry and Eleanor Rose were sleeping the deep sleep of children who are entirely safe and entirely loved. The stone was there. Thomas Talmadge had been a real man who had loved her for 8 years, and who had died too young with debts he had not known how to tell her about, and she carried him. Samuel Talmadge had been a real boy who had lived for 7 weeks and had dark hair and blue eyes, and she carried him too. She had carried them through the worst year and the years after, and she would carry them for all the years that remained. But she was not carrying them alone, and she had not been alone since the October day when a quiet man with dark hair had simply taken hold of the other end of the weight and walked alongside her without asking her to explain it or diminish it or make it smaller for his comfort. She had not put the stone down. She had just stopped walking alone with it. And that, she thought, squeezing Perry Sutton's hand in the starlit New Mexico night, was everything. That was the whole of it. That was what she had not known she needed and what she had been given anyway, without demand, without condition, by a man who had arrived in the worst season of her life and who had simply, quietly, stubbornly refused to let her carry it in an empty room. She looked at him. He looked at her. The stars turned above them, enormous and ancient and entirely indifferent to the smallness of 2 people on a porch in New Mexico territory, but that was all right. Their smallness was the point. Their smallness was everything. 2 small people choosing each other in the enormous dark, choosing the weight and the warmth together, choosing to stay. "I love you," she said. She said it simply, without decoration, the way she had learned to say important things to him over 7 years, directly, without performance, with the full weight of meaning behind every word. He lifted her hand and held it against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating under his ribs, steady, real, permanent. "I love you," he said. "Every part of you, everything you carry, all of it." She leaned her head on his shoulder and he rested his cheek against her hair, and the night moved around them, warm and full of stars. And inside the house Alina Rose made a small dreaming sound and was quiet again. And somewhere on the dark land the cattle moved in the grass, and the north parcel waited to be bought and built upon. And the years ahead were unwritten and full of everything that years are full of: difficulty and joy and grief and harvest and children growing and the slow building of something that lasts. And Jane Talmadge, who was Jane Sutton now and had been for 7 years, breathed in the night air and felt the stone in her chest, familiar as her own heartbeat, and felt the warmth around it, equally familiar, equally permanent, and was, in the deepest and most honest sense of the word, at peace. The north parcel was purchased in July of 1889, and the paperwork was signed by both of them at Bernard Hooper's office. And Hooper shook both their hands and said he had never seen such a turnaround, and he meant it as the highest compliment. And they rode home together in the late afternoon light with the deed in Jane's saddlebag, and the new land stretching out to the north of them, full of possibility. Gabriel Torres came back the following spring, not as a hand but as a neighbor. He had built his own small operation 15 miles west and had a wife named Sophia and a baby son. And he came to see them on a warm April Sunday, and they sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked about cattle and water rights, and the territory's slow, complicated movement toward statehood. And Henry, who was 6 now and long-legged and serious, showed Gabriel his father's horse with the proud authority of a boy who has learned from the best. Sophia Torres, who was from a family that had been in New Mexico for longer than the United States had claimed it, was a warm and forthright woman, and she and Jane were at ease with each other immediately, and over the following years they became genuine friends, which enriched both their lives and taught Jane more about the history and the people of this land that she had claimed as her own, including the injustices of that claiming. The families and communities who had held this land before the territory changed hands, and who had been pushed to its margins as American settlement expanded, a fact that Jane had not known how to fully reckon with when she first arrived, but that she thought about more honestly as the years went on. Alina Rose Sutton grew up with the full benefit of 2 parents who were profoundly committed to her, and a brother who was, in his serious and protective way, an excellent older sibling. And she was, by the time she was 6 and 7, already demonstrating the particular combination of her parents' qualities that made observers smile: her father's steadiness and her mother's absolute refusal to be managed by anything she didn't choose to be managed by. Henry, at 9, had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and a talent for mathematics that delighted Perry and a directness with words that clearly came from Jane. And he was going to be, everyone agreed, a formidable person, and they meant this as the best possible thing. On a Sunday in the fall of 1890, the whole family, Perry and Jane and Henry and Alina Rose, rode out to the top of the long ridge from which you could see the full expanse of the valley and the ranch's land and the hills beyond. The same ridge where 2 people had sat on horseback in the pale November of 1882, and Jane had said she had forgotten it was beautiful here, and Perry had asked her when she had forgotten. The cottonwood trees along the creek had gone yellow and gold in the autumn, and the sky was the deep pure blue that only comes in the high desert in October, and the land was brown and gold and immense, and the cattle were small dark shapes in the distance on the new north pasture. Henry pointed out the property boundaries with the authority of a child who has been taught them thoroughly, and who takes proprietary satisfaction in knowing them. And Alina Rose, who was 2, and was on horseback in front of her father with his arms around her on both sides, pointed at the cattle with the same early enthusiasm that Henry had shown at her age. Jane sat her horse on the edge of the ridge and looked at the valley and felt everything. She always felt the stone and the warmth. Thomas and Samuel present in their absence. This man beside her present in his unshakable presence. These children present with the full shouting life of themselves. Perry moved his horse alongside hers so that they were side by side on the ridge in the autumn light. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which he almost never asked, because he usually read her well enough to know without asking, and the fact that he was asking told her that he wanted to hear her say it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land. "That we built this," she said finally. "All of it. From the worst possible beginning, we built this." "You built it," he said. "I just helped." She turned to look at him, this man she had loved for 8 years and who had walked beside her carrying and never once asking her to set it down, who had been steady through drought and debt and grief and joy and the ordinary extraordinary work of building a life together, and she shook her head. "No," she said. "We built it. There was never a we, that was only one of us." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman he had found at the end of a year of aimless moving. This woman who had taken him in at a table across from her grief and her debt and her absolute refusal to be defeated, who had carried more than anyone should carry alone and who had eventually, when she was ready and not before, let him stand beside the carrying. "No," he agreed. "There wasn't." The October wind came up the ridge and moved through the horse's manes and through Jane's hair and through Perry's coat, and Henry made a sound of pleased complaint about the wind, and Alina Rose giggled from her place in front of her father, and the valley lay gold and enormous below them, this piece of earth that had been claimed and built and grieved upon and loved upon and was, fully and completely, theirs. Jane Talmadge had carried her grief like a stone in her chest. She carried it still. She had carried it through the worst year and the good years that came after, through the debt and the cattle drive and the cold nights and the warm ones, through the building and the growing and the loving that had come to fill all the spaces around the stone without ever displacing it. And Perry Sutton had walked beside the weight, not behind it, not ahead of it, beside it, always beside it. Steady and present and asking nothing except the privilege of continuing to walk alongside the woman who carried it, through all the seasons of a life that had turned out, despite everything, to be exactly worth living. She reached across the space between their horses and found his hand, and he took it, and they sat on the ridge in the autumn light with their children and their land and their years ahead of them and their years behind them. And everything was as it was, and everything was exactly right. And the stone was in her chest, and the warmth was everywhere around it. And the story of how a woman who had forgotten the world was beautiful had found, in the middle of her worst season, a man who simply walked beside her until she could look up and see it again. That story was not over. It was, in every way that counted, just beginning.